Hey everybody! So back in February, I was asked by Sony Pictures to take part in a fun project. We're celebrating the release of Greta Gerwig's Little Women on DVD and Blu-ray April 7th by making gowns inspired by the four March sisters. So I'm Meg. We've also got Angela Clayton as Amy, Rachel Maxey as Jo, and Taylor of Dames a la Mode as Beth. We are tasked with pulling inspiration from both the characterization of the sisters and the Academy Award-winning costumes designed by Jacqueline Durran, but the designs are our own. I wanted to delve into the desires and aspirations of Meg. Basically, I wanted to make her dream dress, because I feel like she deserves it. The debutante ball is such a pivotal moment for her in the film. Her conventional desires can seem boring next to her artistic sisters, but what I like about her characterization in the film is that her wants and desires are shown to be just as valid as the rest. I think a lot of us can relate to her desire for stability and a happy, normal life. The gown she wears in the film is loaned to her from a friend, but what would she wear if she were to have the means and opportunity to design her own ball gown? Personally, I don't look good in pink, and I'm not sure that Meg is all that much of a pink girl either. Throughout the film, she's seen in a color palette of greens, lavenders, blues, and mauves. The pink sets the dress apart as something that was loaned to her, not something that she chose. I went with a neutral cream silk satin for my gown because it was a common color for ball gowns and allowed me to pick a trim accent that tied into her color palette in the film. Meg is still a March though, and the Marches are pretty practical, so I kept the overall trimming and design fairly simple as would befit a young woman in New England in the 1860s. The star of this dress is the yards and yards of silk satin. So now let's get into the making of the gown. For any historical gown, I first start with research, both for style and for patterning. I went through my bookshelf and I found a gown in Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 2 that was perfect for this project. This gown is an early 1860s ball gown, and even though it is from England, it's similar to what we see in the United States in the 1860s as well. I liked this gown for its simplicity and its classic 1860s details with the squared off side back seams, the flared skirt, and the pleated bias cut bertha. These are all features that I incorporated into my own gown. I hand-draped the pattern on the form based on the diagram in Patterns of Fashion, but I didn't scale it up in any way. I basically just used the style lines as a guideline for where I needed to fit it to my form. I first padded up the form to approximate my corseted measurements, but I didn't go too obsessive about this. The reason being is that I was going to do a mock-up fitting anyway, and I could fine-tune the fit on myself then. At this stage, I'm just using a heavy muslin and pins to get the shape on the form. Then I'm going to mark it and remove the pins. My corset is a modified version of our 1860s corset made to fit my long waisted self. I have to add about 1.5 inches in height to that pattern to get it to work for me. I actually can't wear it right off the rack. The hoop skirt shown in these early videos is not the hoop I'm wearing at the end of the project. Towards the end of the project, I realized that I'd prefer to have a more elliptical shaped hoop, and I actually made a new one in about 3 hours right before our photo shoot. The skirt pattern is basically the same one as Patterns of Fashion, but I moved the seam lines around somewhat so that I could take advantage of wider fabric. That's an interesting little note on the film. Meg buys 20 yards of silk, and to us that sounds like so much. And it is. However, at the time period, silks were often quite narrow. In fact, the silk used in the original gown in Patterns of Fashion is only 22 inches wide. The skirt assembly was quite simple, so I didn't record a lot of footage from that. I just flatlined it to a cotton voile, then I machined the seams, serged the raw edges, and pressed it open. There's a placket at center back, and then the rest of the skirt is pleated up in knife pleats that point towards the front until you get to the side, and then at the side they change and shift to point to the back. The last section of skirt at center back is cartridge pleated, as is common for skirts of this era. First, you run 2 parallel running stitches at 1/2 inch lengths, and then draw that up. Then I catch each top of the pleat to the waistband. On most pleats I do 2 stitches, sometimes I do 1. It just sort of depends on the fullness of each individual pleat and how it's going. I also try to remember to tie off every few stitches, so that way if someone were to step on my skirt or the thread were to break, not all of the cartridge pleating will come out. Now, a little note about the waistband. I finished it separately first and then whipped the entire rest of the skirt to it. You can see there on the left the seam allowance of the rest of the pleats of the skirt. That allows all of the bulk to go below the waistband and help for a smoother fit at the waist. Okay, so I thought you all might find this little sequence amusing of me attempting to get into my corset, hoop skirt, and skirt all by myself. It's tricky, and these were definitely fashions designed for a time when people had assistance. But it's still fun. At this point, it's time to fit my mock-up. I made it out of a lightweight cotton twill and had a friend pin up the back. We made small adjustments to the neckline and the waistline. I had to lengthen the waist, which is something I almost always have to do, even when I try to account for my long waist in the patterning stage. I transferred the corrections to the pattern and then cut the flat lining for my bodice out of a cotton sateen and flatlined it to the silk satin fashion fabric. Here I am hand stitching a running stitch just outside of the stitch line in order to flatline the 2 fabrics together. Doing this by hand results in a softer and more malleable result, and it is less likely for your layers to creep as they do under a sewing machine. Once it was flatlined, I serged all of the raw edges except for the waist and neckline, which are going to be finished by bias later, and then stitched all of the seams, with the exception of the side seams, which I put extra seam allowance on and will stitch later so that the bodice is easily alterable for future self. Okay, so that means it's bone time. I apply the bone casings with a little bit of ease. This is called springing the bones, and it allows the bones to have more space to sit flat against the body, and it reduces wrinkling in the finished bodice. I used straight steel bones for this project, and I placed bones at center back, side front, and front seams, as well as the side seam once it was finished and stitched. I finished the neckline of the bodice with a plain bias tape, but for the visible waistline, I made a double bias piping. I used a small embroidery floss as the cord so that the piping would be tiny and dainty. I then applied this to the bottom edge of the bodice pieces, still with the side seams undone, then turned the inside tucked under the edge and whip stitched to the lining. Once this was done, I worked eyelets along the center back in a spiral lacing placement and stitched my side seams. By finishing both edges separately, you end up with a very alterable seam. You don't have to undo any sort of binding or mess with that at all. This is a theater trick, but it absolutely works for historical costuming as well. The sleeves are simple little puffed things with a base of the silk satin and the puff out of a silk organza. Here I'm gathering down the organza to the silk satin base sleeve. I patterned this so that they would be the same length under the arm so that I could do this flat. It's so much easier than trying to gather a large tube onto a smaller tube. I bound the bottom edge of the sleeve in the same silk satin as the gown before stitching the underarm seam. Again, this makes for a very alterable seam, and as you can see, I actually had to take it in just a little bit. Now with the sleeves finished, it's time for the Bertha. Here it is finished on the bodice. I didn't get footage of draping this, but here is what the pattern piece ends up looking like for the front. I essentially copied the Bertha pattern from Patterns of Fashion, but adjusted it to fit my proportions. The Bertha is cut on the bias and is flat-lined with the same cotton voile that I used in the skirt just to give it a little more oomph and allow me to hem the edge invisibly to the inner layer. At this point, it's time to go back to the skirt. To hem it, I created a large facing out of a crispy cotton, and I also put some fusible wig in along the hem just to give it a little bit more oomph. I put velvet ribbon trim along the hem, and I strategically made my facing large enough that I could machine it and then hide the machine stitching with the trim. Speaking of trim, it's time for the fun part. I made bunched loops out of the narrow ribbon and tails out of the wider ribbon to mimic bows, and used fake flowers as the main accents. I chose a mauve kind of color because I felt like it really tied into the colors that Meg wears in the film. And there we have it. I hand-stitched the bodice to the waistband of the skirt to make sure there'd be no gapping, and I also made a hairpiece and styled my wig into an 1860s evening look. This wig was custom made for me by Custom Wig Co, and it's made to match my hairline and my hair color almost exactly. I shot this footage after I'd already worn it for the photo shoot, which is why you see some flyaways. Okay, I know what you guys really want to see is the guts. You want to see the inside of these dresses always. So here you go. We've got the waistband with extra length, so if I ever need to let the dress out, I can. You can also see how I've attached the skirt to the waistband and to the bodice as well. Here's the placket with hooks and bars. And as you can see, I use a mix of historical and modern techniques. So there's serging, but there's also historical construction methods. Here we've got a hanging loop, which is almost as long as the waist to shoulder. What that does is it takes the weight of the skirt off of the shoulder of the gown when I store it on a hanger. Here you can see the small whip stitches attaching the skirt to the waistband through the pleated section. I had first basted the pleats together and then whipped it. I attached the skirt to the bodice by pick stitching through the double piping along the sides and then cross stitching at the back. The front is left free. We've got our sleeves here, and you can see all of my tacking stitches for trims. Here's that fun squared off side back seam. And the way this Bertha works is pretty cool. So the gown closes at center back, but then the Bertha hooks over to the shoulder. I certainly feel ready to go to a ball in this gown, and I feel a little bit of what Meg must have felt when she finally got to dress up and have a fun night. So, don't forget, Little Women is now available on DVD, Blu-ray, and digital. And if you're looking for a new costume flick or you missed it in theaters, this is a great thing to watch if you're stuck at home right now or need some distractions. Plus, there's 45 minutes of bonus content to keep you interested. Also, be sure to check out the work of the other three March sisters.